Cleveland, late autumn, the kind of gray day when even the pigeons looked depressed. That was when I got the call that old Mr. Harris had finally kicked the bucket. To say nobody mourned would be an understatement. The man was universally hated on our street, a sort of neighborhood villain without ever committing a crime anyone could prove. He yelled at kids for stepping on his lawn, cursed at delivery guys, and once called animal control on a woman for letting her dog pee too close to his fence. For decades he lived like a stone in everyone's shoe, and then suddenly he was gone. Just like that. The shock didn't come from his death though. The real shock came a week later when the lawyer gathered a handful of us in a stuffy office downtown. I didn't even want to be there. I figured maybe Harris left me a bill for damages because my tree once shed a branch onto his driveway. Instead, the lawyer read out something that made the whole room go silent. Harris left me his house. Not a distant cousin, not some charity, not even his estranged daughter that people whispered about. Me. John Miller, retired factory worker, the guy who never exchanged more than a dozen sentences with him in 20 years. Suddenly, the nastiest man in Cleveland had made me a homeowner. Now, I wasn't broke, but free property in this economy? My sister Linda was already nudging me, whispering that I should flip it quick before the roof caved in. But it wasn't that simple. There was more. Along with the deed, tucked inside the envelope, was a small brass key taped to a piece of paper. The paper had only 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. For John only. That's when I felt something crawl down my spine. Why me? Why the hell me? The house itself stood like a stubborn old man at the end of Willow Street. A squat 2-story structure with peeling paint, shutters hanging like loose teeth, and a porch that sagged under its own weight. Everyone avoided it and kids dared each other to ring the doorbell on Halloween. Rumors grew around it like weeds. Some swore Harris buried money in the backyard. Others said he had a tunnel leading to Lake Erie. Personally, I always thought he just liked being hated because it kept people away. Walking through the front door after the will was settled felt like trespassing. The air smelled of dust, stale tobacco, and something older like a mix between mothballs and regret. The furniture looked frozen in time. Heavy oak, floral upholstery faded to the color of dishwater, curtains drawn so tight that barely a sliver of light crept in. It wasn't a home, it was a bunker. I kept thinking of the key in my pocket, heavier with each step I took. Growing up in Cleveland, I'd seen my fair share of eccentric neighbors. But Harris was in a league of his own. He shouted at passing cars, wrote complaint letters to the city every other week, and had once chased the mailman down the street for supposedly bending his subscription to the plain dealer. People whispered he'd worked at the steel mill until something broke in him, maybe his back, maybe his mind. I only knew he was alone. No wife, no friends, no family visits, just a cranky old man rattling around that house like a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead yet. The night after I first walked in, I couldn't sleep. The key sat on my dresser, catching the glow of the streetlight through the blinds. It wasn't an ordinary key. It was ornate, with an old-fashioned design, like it belonged to a safe or a locked chest, not a modern door. My imagination started running wild. Was Harris some closet millionaire with gold bars in the basement? Or was I about to open something I'd regret? Cleveland isn't exactly full of treasure hunters, but every town has its secrets. Linda called me the next morning. She had that tone she always used when she thought I was being stupid, which was often. She told me to sell the house as is, key and all, and not to get mixed up in dead men's games. But something in me resisted. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stubbornness. Truth is, retirement gets boring fast, and Harris had just handed me a puzzle. I wasn't ready to walk away without seeing what pieces fit together. I started spending my days at the house, clearing out cobwebs and sorting through his junk. Piles of newspapers dating back decades, jars of screws and nails, receipts from stores that no longer existed. It was like Harris had tried to preserve every scrap of his life in case someone cared enough to look. Nobody did. Until now. And while I sorted, I kept finding locked drawers, padlocked cabinets, and boxes sealed with tape so old it crumbled at my touch. Each one whispered the same question. Was this where the key belonged? I tried the key in the obvious places first. Desk drawers, cabinets, even the front door locks. Nothing. It didn't fit anywhere. Which only made it worse. That damn key wasn't just a clue, it was an invitation. Harris had left it specifically for me and now I couldn't let it go. The breaking point came when I discovered a door in the basement I'd never noticed before. Iron, not wood, with a handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My pulse quickened just looking at it. I didn't try the key yet. Not then. I stood there, holding it in my hand, staring at the door and wondering if Harris was laughing from the grave. He'd been hated by everyone, sure. But maybe he'd left me more than a house. Maybe he'd left me a secret no one else was meant to find. I spent the next few days circling that basement door like a man circling the edge of a swimming pool he wasn't sure he wanted to dive into. The key in my pocket had turned into a constant reminder, heavier than my wallet and twice as distracting. I'd find myself fingering it at the grocery store checkout line, at the gas station, even while falling asleep on my recliner. But fear has a funny way of disguising itself as procrastination, so instead of trying it in that lock, I decided to focus on making the rest of the house livable. That's how the routine began. The place was a museum of bad taste. Wallpaper in the upstairs hallway peeled in strips like sunburnt skin. The bathroom had a toilet so ancient it belonged in a plumbing exhibit, and the kitchen was lined with cabinets painted a sickly shade of avocado green. Yet the strangest thing was how neat everything remained. Dust gathered on the surfaces, sure, but Harris hadn't been a slob. Every spoon was in its drawer, every tool on its peg, every newspaper stacked in tidy towers like he'd been preparing for some grand inspection. It was unsettling, like he knew someone, me, would eventually come snooping through it all. My sister Linda stopped by on the second day, armed with rubber gloves and a judgmental glare. She had a way of looking around a room and making you feel like you were living in a landfill. She warned me not to get too attached, not to romanticize the place. Clean it up, sell it, and don't get caught in the ghost of someone else's life, she said. Easy for her. She had a condo in a newer part of town with granite countertops and neighbors who smiled. But as much as she lectured, I noticed her curiosity peeking through. She kept poking at locked drawers and rattling handles. When she asked about the basement, I lied and told her it was flooded. Then there was Mark, the neighbor across the street. He showed up with a six-pack of cheap beer and the kind of grin that said he'd been waiting years for Harris to die. He treated me like a comrade in arms, the guy chosen to storm the castle. Mark insisted Harris had been hiding something. He rattled off every rumor I'd heard over the years. Buried treasure, bootleg whiskey, maybe even a body or two. He told me to call him if I found anything worth sharing, which I took as code for anything valuable enough to pawn. The man wasn't subtle. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone expected me to find something. That's the problem with inheriting a house with a story attached. You stop owning it and start being owned by it. Every locked drawer teased me, every unopened box whispered promises of a secret just out of reach. And the key was always in my pocket, taunting me like a dare I hadn't taken yet. While clearing out the study one afternoon, I stumbled on something that only fueled my unease. A stack of yellowed newspaper clippings lay in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. They were all about missing people, local cases from the 70s and 80s, teenagers who never came home from school, men who disappeared after leaving a bar, women last seen waiting for a bus. Harris had circled names, scribbled notes in the margins. Liar, he'd scrawled across one. They know, across another. My heart thumped harder with each sheet I read. It was obsessive, maybe paranoid, maybe something worse. Another day I found a box of letters addressed but never mailed. Most were written to Emily Harris, who I assumed was his daughter. The handwriting started neat and then grew shaky, almost desperate. He apologized in some, begged in others, and in a few he sounded downright angry. I pieced together that they'd fallen out decades ago, and she'd never answered him. The bitterness in his words felt raw even after all those years, like wounds that never scabbed over. The deeper I went, the more the house stopped feeling like a structure of wood and brick and more like a diary. Each room told a story, each drawer confessed a sin. But the loudest voice was the basement, humming beneath my feet every time I stepped across the floorboards. That iron door waited, patient and cold. The key in my pocket had grown familiar to the touch, its grooves imprinted on my thumb like a brand. I hadn't even used it, yet it was already changing me. Nights were the worst. I'd sit in the old recliner Harris had probably died in, staring at the walls, feeling the house breathe around me. The radiator hissed like it was whispering, the floorboards groaned like footsteps. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, dreams of the locked door jolted me awake. Sometimes I heard scratching, faint but persistent, like something trapped was trying to get out. I told myself it was just mice. But mice don't use keys. By the end of the week, I wasn't laughing at haunted house jokes anymore. Something about Harris's orderliness, his clippings, his letters, it didn't add up to just a cranky old man. It felt like preparation. As if he'd been building a vault not just for his possessions but for his truth. And somehow, for reasons I couldn't understand, he'd chosen me to inherit it. When I finally decided to confront that basement door, it wasn't out of bravery. It was exhaustion. The not knowing had become worse than the fear of finding out. I stood in front of it one evening with the key in hand, the iron cold beneath my fingers. My reflection in the metal looked like a stranger's face. I slid the key toward the lock, heart pounding, breath shallow. And just before I turned it, I stopped. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's behind a locked door. It's the thought that once you open it, you can never unknow what you find. I don't remember the exact moment when hesitation turned into resolve. Maybe it was the silence of the house pressing down on me, maybe it was the clippings about missing people that kept gnawing at my mind, or maybe it was the way the key seemed to burn in my pocket every time I walked past that iron door. Whatever it was, one evening I finally turned the lock. The sound was sharper than I expected, a metallic click that echoed through the basement as if the house itself had been holding its breath. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges shrieking like they hadn't moved in decades. The air that spilled out was thick and stale, tinged with the smell of old wood and something faintly chemical, like varnish or maybe cleaning fluid that had evaporated years ago. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The room wasn't large, but it was crowded. Boxes were stacked against the walls, an old workbench sat beneath a single dangling light bulb, and shelves bowed under the weight of binders, jars, and rusting tools. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight like tiny ghosts rising to greet me. It was not a dungeon or a treasure chamber. It was more like an archive. Harris had been keeping things, cataloging them, protecting them. My first instinct was disappointment, the kind you get when you build up a mystery in your head only to discover it looks like a glorified storage closet. But as I opened the first box, disappointment gave way to something heavier. Inside were journals, dozens of them, their covers cracked and their pages filled with Harris's tight, obsessive handwriting. I picked one at random, dated 1984. The entries weren't about his daily routine or the weather. They were long, angry rants about people in the neighborhood. He cataloged slights, insults, rumors, and betrayals with the precision of a detective building a case. He named names. He accused people of lying, stealing, cheating, conspiring against him. It was paranoia on paper, but beneath the venom, I sensed something more complicated. I read until my eyes blurred. Harris wrote about being wronged at the steel mill, about men who sabotaged his work, about bosses who overlooked him. He wrote about neighbors who snubbed him, about the city council ignoring his complaints. He described people not as individuals but as enemies in a long drawn-out war that only he seemed to be fighting. The bitterness oozed off the pages, but tucked between the lines I caught glimpses of loneliness. He wasn't just angry, he was wounded. On the workbench, beneath a pile of yellowed rags, I found an old tape recorder with a box of cassettes beside it. Each tape was labeled with dates and cryptic words: confession, witness, Emily. My hand shook as I slid one into the recorder and pressed play. The hiss of static filled the room, then a voice, Harris's voice, raspier than I remembered, cracked with age. He spoke slowly, deliberately, like a man leaving behind testimony. He talked about the town, about the fire at the mill in the 70s that killed 2 men. Officially, it was ruled an accident, caused by faulty wiring. But Harris claimed he'd seen something else. Someone leaving the site minutes before the flames erupted, carrying tools that didn't belong to him. He named names, but I didn't recognize them. Maybe they were long gone, or maybe they'd been hiding in plain sight. The tape ended with Harris muttering, "No one believed me. No one wanted to." I pressed stop and sat in the silence, pulse racing. Suddenly the clippings made sense. Harris wasn't just hoarding random tragedies. He was building a case, one the rest of us had ignored. And yet, part of me wondered if it was real or just the ramblings of a bitter old man desperate to make sense of a world that left him behind. I moved to the next box, this one lighter. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some black and white, others faded Polaroids. They were of ordinary people, kids riding bikes, men mowing lawns, women walking dogs. On the back of each photo, Harris had written notes. Some were single words like liar or thief. Others were longer, accusing people of acts I couldn't prove or disprove. It was disturbing, voyeuristic, like stepping into the mind of a man who couldn't separate suspicion from fact. Then I found the letters. Bundled together with twine, written in that same uneven scrawl, all addressed to Emily Harris, his daughter. The first ones were tender, apologizing for being a bad father, begging her to visit. Then they grew darker, accusing her of betrayal, of siding with her mother, of abandoning him. By the end, the letters were practically unhinged, desperate pleas mixed with venom. Reading them made my throat tighten. Whatever had happened between them, it had scarred them both beyond repair. I set the letters down and leaned against the workbench. The room felt smaller now, closing in around me. The journals, the tapes, the photos, the letters, they weren't just evidence of a crank's paranoia. They were the legacy of a man who had been eaten alive by his grudges and regrets. And now, somehow, they were mine. I shut off the recorder and stared at the shelves, at the lifetimes of anger bottled up in cardboard and ink. A chill ran through me as I realized Harris hadn't left me the house as a gift. He had left me a burden. He wanted me to see it all, to hold it, to decide what to do with it. The key hadn't opened treasure, it had opened a wound. As I locked the door again and climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the thought that Harris hadn't trusted anyone else with this secret. Not his daughter, not the neighbors, not the city. Just me, the man who'd barely spoken to him. And I had to ask myself why. Was it because he thought I was honest? Or because he knew once I'd opened that door, I wouldn't be able to turn back? I couldn't stay away from the basement for long. Every time I tried to distract myself with repairs upstairs or even stepping outside to rake the yard, the thought of those boxes and tapes pulled me back down like a magnet. Harris's voice haunted me, whispering through static on that recorder, insisting that something had happened at the steel mill that no one wanted to admit. It gnawed at me the way unfinished puzzles gnaw at obsessive minds. I told myself I was just curious, but the truth was simpler and darker. I was hooked. The next tape I played carried the label Confession. My thumb trembled as I pressed play. Harris's voice cracked with fatigue, but the words were clear. He spoke of a man named O'Connor, a foreman at the mill back in 1977. According to Harris, O'Connor had been cutting corners, ignoring safety checks, and bribing inspectors to look the other way. Harris claimed he had evidence, receipts, signatures, even photographs, but when he tried to expose it, the union shut him out and the company threatened him. Then came the fire. 2 men dead, 1 injured so badly he never walked again. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but Harris insisted O'Connor caused it through negligence. Worse, Harris claimed someone in the city council helped bury the truth to protect the mill's reputation. I sat in that basement, the hum of the tape filling the silence, and felt my gut twist. Harris might have been paranoid, but this wasn't just the rant of a lonely man. His details were too sharp, too specific. Either he had witnessed something real, or he had built an entire mythology around lies. I rewound the tape, played it again, and scribbled notes. The longer I listened, the more it sounded like a man carrying guilt, because he hadn't stopped it, because he hadn't saved those men. On another tape labeled Emily, Harris's voice shifted from anger to sorrow. He spoke directly to his daughter, as though she were sitting across from him. He told her he was sorry for the way he drove her mother away, sorry for the nights he drank instead of tucking her into bed. But then his tone hardened. He blamed her for leaving, blamed her for not believing him about the fire, accused her of siding with them. His obsession with the mill tragedy had cost him not just his reputation but his family. Listening to him unravel on tape made my chest tighten. Harris had been both villain and victim, a man who let bitterness rot everything inside him. I kept digging through the basement. In a locked trunk I found what looked like the evidence Harris claimed to have. Photographs of rusted equipment, receipts for late-night deliveries, documents with O'Connor's name signed at the bottom. Were they genuine? I couldn't be sure. They looked real enough, but decades had passed. Maybe they were forgeries, maybe not. Still, they painted a picture that matched Harris's accusations. He hadn't been making it up entirely. Word must have gotten out that I was spending time in the house, because soon enough neighbors started asking questions. Mark stopped by again, pretending to be friendly but his eyes darting like a scavenger's. He wanted to know if I'd found the treasure. Linda kept calling, insisting I pack up and leave before I lost myself in Harris's madness. I brushed them both off, but part of me knew they were right. The deeper I went, the more the house owned me. Then one evening there was a knock at the door that stopped me cold. A woman stood on the porch, maybe in her late 40s, her face tired but her eyes sharp. She introduced herself as Emily Harris. I didn't know what to say. She told me she'd heard about her father's will and needed to know why a stranger had been chosen over her. The resentment in her voice was thick, but underneath I caught the tremor of someone who had been wounded long ago. I let her inside, uneasy but curious. She walked through the rooms like a visitor in a museum of her own childhood, touching the banister, brushing her fingers across the kitchen counter. I saw her jaw tighten when she noticed the stack of unopened letters I'd placed on the table. She didn't pick them up. Instead she asked what I had found in the basement. I hesitated, then told her about the journals and the tapes. Her expression darkened. She said her father had been obsessed with the fire for years, that it consumed every conversation until she couldn't bear it anymore. She accused him of ruining her life with his fixation. And yet, when I offered to let her listen to a tape, she froze. She said she couldn't. Not yet. That night, after she left, I sat in the basement again with the key in my hand. Harris had chosen me, not his own daughter, to inherit his secrets. Maybe he knew she wouldn't want them, couldn't handle them. Or maybe he wanted her to hear them through someone else's voice. Either way, the responsibility weighed heavier now. This wasn't just about whether to believe a bitter old man. This was about whether to drag a decades-old tragedy into the light, risking the pain of reopening wounds that might never heal. The next morning I looked out the window and saw Mark again, lingering on the sidewalk, pretending to check his mailbox. He was waiting, watching, hoping. The neighborhood was buzzing with speculation, and I knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Harris had given me the key to his secrets, but he hadn't told me what to do with them. Should I expose what I'd found, risking the wrath of a community that had already written him off as a lunatic? Or should I bury it all again, sealing that basement door for good? As I shut off the lights and climbed the stairs, one thought followed me like a shadow. Secrets have a way of demanding daylight whether you want to release them or not. Ann Harris's secret was clawing its way toward the surface. I didn't sleep much after Emily's visit. Her face lingered in my mind, that mixture of anger and sorrow, like someone who had carried a wound so long she no longer knew how to live without it. The house felt heavier with her presence, as though her father's spirit had stirred at the sound of her voice. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the decision. Harris hadn't left me the house for comfort or profit. He had left me a question, and it demanded an answer. The next day I called Emily and asked her to come back. She resisted at first, but curiosity must have won because by late afternoon she stood again in the doorway. This time I didn't hesitate. I led her down to the basement, past the boxes and shelves, to the workbench where the recorder and tapes waited. I handed her a cassette labeled, "For Emily." Her fingers shook as she held it. I told her I hadn't listened yet, that it was hers to hear first. She stared at the machine for what felt like forever before pressing play. Her father's voice filled the basement, shaky but deliberate. He spoke to her like she was there, apologizing, pleading, confessing. He admitted he had failed her as a father, that his anger had poisoned everything. Then he spoke of the fire. He claimed he had taken the blame, or at least allowed the rumors about him to spread, because the truth would have destroyed people she knew. He never said exactly who, only that they were men with power, men who could crush him and her if he fought them. "Better they hate me," he rasped, "than they bury you." The tape ended with silence, broken only by the click of the machine. Emily's face crumpled. She didn't cry, not exactly, but her shoulders sagged under a weight I couldn't lift. She whispered that she had spent years believing her father hated her, when maybe all along he thought he was protecting her. The revelation didn't erase the past, but it shifted the ground beneath her feet. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but the story she had carried in her heart all these years was no longer the same. Together we dug deeper into the boxes, piecing together the fragments of Harris's life. The evidence of corruption at the mill was there, messy but convincing. Receipts, photos, even letters from city officials that hinted at backroom deals. Harris hadn't been crazy. He had been silenced. And when no one listened, he built a fortress of bitterness around himself, locking away the truth with his anger. By the time we finished, Emily sat on the floor surrounded by papers, staring at them as though they were relics from another universe. I asked her what she wanted to do. She shook her head. Too much time had passed, too many people were gone, and stirring up the past would only burn the living. She said maybe her father understood that, which was why he never exposed it. Maybe leaving the house to me wasn't about revenge or redemption but about ensuring the truth wouldn't vanish completely. Someone else had to know. Someone who wasn't tied to the old grudges. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Harris hadn't chosen me because I was special. He had chosen me because I was ordinary. A retired man with no stake in the town's battles, no debts to the mill, no history with the council. I was a clean slate, a pair of eyes unclouded by personal grudges. By leaving me the key, Harris had given me the choice he could never make, whether to expose or to preserve. In the weeks that followed, Emily and I sifted through the rest of the basement. We boxed up what mattered, burned what didn't, and argued about what to keep. Slowly, she began to talk about her childhood, about the small moments before her father's obsession consumed him. A trip to the lake. Ice cream on summer nights. It was as though by confronting the darkest parts of his life, she could finally allow herself to remember the lighter ones. I never went public with the story. The evidence might have been real, but dragging it into the light after so many decades felt like reopening graves. Instead, I wrote it all down, every word, every discovery, every doubt. I sealed it in an envelope and left it with a note for Emily. If she ever decided the world needed to know, she would be the one to tell it. Until then, it would remain between us, a secret shared rather than a curse carried alone. When the house was finally sold, I stood on the sagging porch one last time. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after a storm. Neighbors still gossiped, of course. They whispered about me, about Emily, about what Harris might have left behind. Let them. I knew the truth, and the truth was more complicated than their stories could ever capture. Harris had been a bitter man, yes, but he had also been a father who tried in his twisted way to protect his daughter. He had been a victim of corruption and his own rage, a man trapped by secrets he couldn't share. As I closed the door and walked away, I realized the real inheritance wasn't the house. It was the lesson buried in its walls. We think we know our neighbors, we think we understand the villains in our stories, but often we only see the surface. Harris had lived and died under a cloud of hatred, but beneath it lay a truth no one wanted to face. Sometimes the people we despise carry burdens heavier than we imagine. Sometimes the locks they build aren't meant to keep us out but to keep us safe. That night I slept for the first time in weeks. The key still lay on my dresser, cold and silent, but it no longer taunted me. It had done its job. It had opened not just a door but a perspective. And as I drifted off, I thought of Harris, the man everyone hated, who left me his house and, in the end, left me a choice. A choice to see beyond bitterness, to carry truth without letting it rot me from the inside. In the end, I didn't become Harris. I became the one who understood him. And maybe, just maybe, that was what he had wanted all along. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.